Julian MacGowan, a name I've known quite a bit. We've got a mutual friend, Mr. Gary Sykes.
Yeah.
Absolute lots of love for Gary. He's been to stay at my house a few times. Character. But before we go into a few things, Nick Manners, Junior Witter, Josh Warrington, Paul Sykes, Tommy Miller, had lots of names from the Yorkshire boxing industry. How did you get involved with the art of pugilism, Julian?
I was always a massive fan of boxing. My brother, my dad were big boxing people. So I remember like 6, 7 years old, my dad and my brother are really excited, looking forward to the big fights on TV, you know, Ali, etc. And I just kind of fell into it from then. But I didn't actually start boxing until I was about 15 years old. A group of myself and my friends went down to Keith Tate's boxing gym, home champions, ABC, about 1985, 1986. And I was one of those things, I was a massive boxing fan, but I'd never actually taken the step towards doing it myself until that point. And I guess everything just grew from there, really, Jamie.
So, I mean, Keith Tate, I never met him, but I spoke to him a hell of a lot of times. Childhood friend of Paul Sykes. I actually dug a picture out for Keith of him and Paul Sykes from 1961 when they were kids. I spoke to him many times. Lovely old fella. He was literally what boxing should be about. He was all about the grassroots of boxing, and of course, he beat the maybe second greatest fighter of all time in Ken Buchanan.
He absolutely did. He beat Ken Buchanan when Buchanan was an amateur who nobody could touch. But Keith Tate was a brilliant amateur. I think he won about 6 or 7 schoolboys titles and used to do the coal board titles and all those kind of things back in the day. And it was fantastic. And Keith actually still used to spar with the young amateurs when he was in his early 40s. So I was 15, 16-year-old when I was an amateur boxer sparring with Keith Tate. And obviously you always kept it respectful, but you couldn't hit the man. He was so slippery. He was a converted southpaw, and he was just so talented. And it's one of those things that, you know, in later years we didn't really get on so much, but you can't take away what Keith Tate did for Yorkshire boxing.
So, I mean, what did you do as an amateur then? Were you, like, obviously, so you were kind of classed as a junior then? How many bouts did you have?
And nothing special, Jamie, at all. I was always, one of the things that really disarms people when they're around me is I'm quite brutally honest. Not just brutally honest with people, but brutally honest with myself. So I only had 14 amateur fights. I won 8 and I lost 6. Pretty average fighter on the club level. I boxed a couple of decent kids. I lost a couple of fights away from home on away shows on majority decisions, and generally you know what that means when that happens. You know how the amateur game works. But I wouldn't say I was average, but I was just decent, and I was always kind of realistic about my own ability. But the thing about me, Jamie, was obviously I started boxing at 15. I had 8 fights in my first season as a junior. And then when I was senior, I only had 6 amateur fights over about 4 years. Really spread it out. I was studying full time. So I spent 5 years at art school. I was also doing night classes. I had 3 part-time jobs to hold down while I went through college. And boxing was only ever a hobby for me. It was something that I would pick up, I would get in shape, I'd have a fight, and then I'd focus on my studies and take some time out. And I went 2 years without boxing from 1990 until 1992. I lost my last 2 amateur fights, and it ate away at me for quite some time. And I thought that's not really the way you want to go out. So I literally put everything together in 1992, and I trained for 4 or 5 weeks, trained my backside off. I got fit, had a good win, beat a kid on an home show. I'm always proud of that moment. But for me, that was a perfectly natural thing to do, was then to sign off from that. But I was always in the gym in good company. So the likes of Steve Conway, James Hare, Mark Hobson, Adi Benton, really good domestic level kids. They were teammates of mine. So I was always around good fighters. Keith Tate's gym was a pro-am gym. wasn't really legal at the time, you know, but amateurs and pros used to mix. And you just kind of, I used to pick the best from watching the pros at the side of me, good honest pros like Charlie Watson, Tony Brown, who actually beat Johnny Nelson in Nelson's early career. And those were times, Jamie, I look back at those, they give me fantastic lessons in life, gave me real strength of character, because I was quite a shy kid. I grew up, my dad was a bit of a fighting man, my brother was quite handy with his fists, and I was the quiet, sensitive, creative one. And boxing really just, it brings you out of yourself, doesn't it? And anything I do in life today, you know, whether I'm presenting to high-level clients or I'm stood up presenting in front of 500 people, anything I do in life, I always put down to the fact that, and I know you've been there yourself, if you can get in the ring in front of a few hundred people in some tough working man's club as a kid, you can do absolutely anything.
Yeah. I mean, was there any thought on going pro, Julian, or no?
There was one conversation, it was actually after my last amateur fight, where Keith had a little bit of a conversation with me, and he sort of said, look, MacGowan, you're not being prolific as an amateur. Your style's probably more suited to the pros. Do you fancy giving it a go? And I was just coming up to graduating at that time with my illustration and graphic design background. And I was coming up to graduating, and I had a conversation with my dad and my mum, and I sort of said, there's an opportunity to go pro. Keith thinks I'd do well. And my dad sort of said, you need to really think about this. You need to have a real think about this, because the likelihood is you'd have had more success in the amateurs, and you'd have done more in the amateurs if you're going to have that success in the pros. I know it doesn't always go that way, but what that does, Jamie, is it gives you an insight into how grounded I was as a kid. So my parents were always very, very grounded, not like this kind of X Factor generation where people think, you know, my son, my daughter's special and they're going to be this, they're going to be that. I was grounded as a kid, and my dad was like, I probably don't think you're going to make it as a pro, but it's up to you. If you want to do that, we'll support you. And I thought about it. I'd just started a relationship at that time. I'd been offered a job in design, and I just thought, maybe I'll go back to it at some point. So I decided against it, Jamie, but that's not me being negative. It's not me thinking that I couldn't have made as a pro. I just me being realistic and thinking, you know, when the kids I was training with, the Steve Conways and the James Ayres, they were so much better than me. And I was always really open about that. So I thought, it's probably not for you.
Do you know something? You don't often hear someone as brutally honest, because listen, I lost a lot more than I won. But you meet people in and you think, what's up? I remember you. You're full of shit. So it's been quite refreshing listening to that. But can I ask you, Julian? So when I think of Dewsbury, where you're from, one person's name comes to me, and it was the Eyes of the World in 2008, Karen Matthews.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. We were obviously, Gary Sykes lived on the next street to Karen Matthews, so I remember it happening as and when it happened, and picking Sykes up every night for training. And I always found it quite the irony, really, where people were out looking for Shannon, and I'd be parked up waiting for Sykes. He was always late, you know, and I'd be sat watching the news and the calendar guys walking backwards and forwards. And what always struck me was that there was a child that we believe had been abducted, and there were little 4 and 5-year-old kids just wandering around the estate late at night on their own, and it was just a bizarre time. And there was one point, and this was in a book about Karen Matthews, there was a point where we got approached. Gary said, I've been asked to wear the Find Shannon Matthews t-shirt into one of his fights. And this was literally about a week before, obviously, they found her hidden in the bed. And Sykes would never do anything without asking me, the relationship that we had. He was as daft as a brush, and he says, what do you think, Jules? And I went, I don't think it's something we should do, Gary. I says, there's something not quite right about this whole thing. So let's avoid wearing the Shannon Matthews t-shirts on Sky Sports. Let's forget that one. And luckily we did.
Well, before I go into it, I want to talk about Gary Sykes, because he's a very good friend of mine. I've got lots of love for him. But there's another Sykes which kind of I kind of suppose made my name, if you like. But I've done 3 books on him. It's been signed to be a film. I know who's playing him. I know the 80s band who's probably doing the soundtrack. So it's going to be big news. Paul Sykes, was he a big name around the Yorkshire boxing industry and also your way, West Yorkshire?
Yeah, definitely, because obviously the Lupsit estate was about 4 miles away from where I lived. And the reason I knew of Sykes was, first of all, through Keith Tate. Keith Tate would always tell us the stories of Paul Sykes, and he says he knew Paul, he was good friends with Paul, but he said there were times in the gym where they trained together as professionals where Keith said Paul could just clear a gym. It would be that way out, he'd be in a bad mood, or he'd be a little bit argumentative, and he says he could clear a gym like nothing you've ever seen. Now, Keith Tate was a bantamweight. It was about 5'5" and about 8.5 stone, and absolutely nobody intimidated Keith Tate. I've seen Keith Tate go up against pro fighters, have arguments with them, and never ever back down. Gary will tell you that about Keith. But Keith always said to me, Paul was the one person who would clear the gym. And if it was that way out, he said, I would leave the gym. He says, I used to sometimes stagger my training times when he was just not on good form. But what Keith also said was Paul Sykes was absolutely hilarious as well. He says it could be like so warm, it could be friendly. He said, but it could be really, really funny. He says it just depended what version of Paul that he got.
Yeah. I mean, Keith did tell me a story when Keith was there. I think it was the early, let me think, Sykes was 46. So it'll have been about 1960. Sykes will have been about 14. And he's just turned and belted his dad. So that's what Keith said to me. I mean, you told me some stories the other day, Julian, about like your mum had a few run-ins in with Sykes.
Yeah, she didn't have run-ins as such. My mum used to work at a really well-known butcher's called Cross's Butchers. And Dewsbury Market is, everybody in the north of England at one point would go shopping on Dewsbury Market. And my mum was a supervisor on this butcher's store, what had been open about 110 years, famous butcher's store. And she said Paul would come into Dewsbury. I think it was later on in his life.
Yeah, it'll have been when he was back the whole of Wakefield. He used to go to a pub in Dewsbury called, is it the Black Bull or something?
That's the one, that's right. And my mum said Paul was always really respectful. But what they used to do was they used to queue around the front and Paul would just pop around the side of the store and he'd always ask my mum. My mum was really friendly and he'd always say, have you got any pies, love? And she'd give him a couple of pork pies. Yeah, he'd buy a couple and she'd give him a couple of extras. And she said it was chatty, but she knew who he was because, well, for 2 reasons. One, because when they aired the ITV programme, we all watched it, of course, and it became, and I'm not glorifying Paul, by the way, but it became a bit of a cult thing in our house. We probably had VHS video recorder then, or whatever it was, and we recorded it. Me and my brother, we watched it several times because we knew all about Paul Sykes from the stories that we'd heard from Keith and from my dad. So my mum knew who he was, but she said he was kind of like, chatty, but she said he was quite charming, but a little bit insistent that he got served sometimes ahead of the queue. But she knew who he was, and everybody knew Paul Sykes from literally in West Yorkshire. I don't know anybody who didn't know him. And the one story I did hear, Jamie, and this is a story, as you know yourself, they're not always easy to corroborate, but because I've heard about Sykes' reputation, this is very believable, and what you just said about his dad. So my dad used to work at Charleston Colliery. My dad and my brother worked down the pit, and obviously the pit bus used to go from Dewsbury to the Lupsit estate, pick up some guys and take them to work down Charleston. My dad used to work with a guy called Buzzer. That was his nickname. I don't know what his real name was. And he was a good mate of Sykes. Now, Buzzer was once in Sykes' house, and it was, my dad's told this story so many times, and he says Buzzer was sat with Sykes, and he heard some rustling, and he heard some groaning, just this kind of like, just some noise groaning from the next room. I don't think it was from upstairs. I think it was from the next room. And Buzzer had said to Paul, he says, Paul, what's that noise? And Paul's like, never you mind about that. You just, carry on. They're having a coffee or a beer. I've got no idea. And he said they heard this noise 2 or 3 times. And because he knew Paul, he goes, Paul, come on, what's this noise? And he just goes, it's just my father in there, ignore him. and Buzzer went into the next room, and apparently he'd actually tied his dad up. He says he's been a pain in the arse. You might have heard these stories. He's been a pain in the arse. He's been a bit of a gobbing off a little bit. So I've just quietened him down for a little bit. And apparently he'd tied his dad up. Now, I don't know if that's true or not. The way you're nodding, you might think you might have heard that yourself, Jamie.
I used to lock him under the bed. In actual fact, Walter only had one eye. Paul hit him. He lost sight of it. Wow. Yeah, could go on and on about that. But certainly a unique character. I mean, him alone drew me into writing books. Without Paul Sykes, I would never ever have. I often say, I read Sweet Agony, I watched the documentary, and I walked into the story and I met all the characters.
Yeah.
But do you find the interested in? Can you understand that, Julian?
Absolutely, because listen, we're human beings. We're voyeurs by nature. We're interested in these dark characters. People sometimes make the mistake of saying, you're glorifying what's going on. So I once put something about Paul Sykes on Facebook. I'm no longer on Facebook, but years ago, and a couple of people literally jumped on me, and they just said he was a bully, he was a this, he was a that. I says, I'm not saying he was or he wasn't. What I'm saying is that it was as probably as evil and nasty as it could be, was equally as charming and funny. And I says, we are drawn to characters. Look at the Cray twins. Look at all of these films that are based on crime. They sell, and as humans, we're drawn to the dark side of human nature. It's a bit like rubbernecking. You see we're driving along the motorway and you see the blue lights, and you see a crash at the side of the road, and it's human nature to look and to see what's going on. And we are as we are, aren't we? And I think that's the thing. I'm not glamorizing Paul. I'm just saying, from a ex-boxer, boxing coach's point of view, he's an interesting character because I'd heard about him from various people, but he's also an interesting character because you always wonder how good someone like that could have been had he really had the discipline. Yeah, he missed all those years inside. You always wonder how good he could have been. So I think there's just a fascination with people like that.
I'll tell you, a scary statistic is from the ages of 17 to 30, he was only outside for 9 months. So for someone like that, having prime years eaten by locusts, and to come out and fight for the British and the Commonwealth, I think that's quite remarkable.
Well, you don't hear of it, do you? You don't hear of people who have a lack of professional grounding. And I think when you thought John L. Gardner, you know the data better than I do, but he must have had less than a dozen fights when he fought John L. And John L. Gardner was a really good fighter.
So he still holds the record, in my opinion, that'll never be beat, where anyone competes for the British title or the Commonwealth after only 8 fights. It just will never be done again. Maybe done for the flyweight, but to think of what Sykes done on a diet of literally bread and water, in my opinion, is staggering.
Yeah, and that's the fascination, isn't it? Because you look at guys like that and you think, what would he have done nowadays with sponsors? But he probably would have never had the discipline. But it just showed what a tough man he was. And I guess it was kind of ironic that he actually almost surrendered in that fight. I don't know if it was a fragile mentality. I don't know. But I've seen the fight 2 or 3 times. But he gave John L. Gardner a good fight, for the first 4 or 5 rounds. But he gassed out, and he probably gassed out because he lacked experience, he lacked ring time, and probably didn't train as hard as he should have done, really.
Yeah. Colin Hart did say to me, he said, in all the years I've studied British boxing, he said, there's never been anyone who was really as bad to the core. I suppose he was kind of Britain's Sonny Liston, if you like. But going on to another Sykes, Gary Sykes, how did you become involved with Gary, Julian?
Well, what happened with Sykes was that when I finished my amateur career, about 1996, 97, I started coaching amateurs at Keith's Gym. And it might have even been before then, Jamie, to be honest. And I was working with a lot of amateurs. And I took Gary Sykes. I used to train the seniors. and Sykes was a junior at the time, and Keith used to leave early, leave me with the seniors. But Sykes used to kind of hang around, and he'd only been in the gym a few months, and he used to watch me coaching. He liked my coaching style, and he used to watch with Mally McIver and other good kids like that. And he said to Keith, can I do both sessions? Because he loved training. Can I train with the juniors? Can I train with Jules? And Keith's like, absolutely fine, Gary. And then Gary's debut was actually in Redcar. And what happened was Keith said to me, he says, I can't make it tonight. And he had two lads at the same weight, Gary Sykes and a lad called Chris Dawson. And Keith said to me, have a look at the kid who, it's actually Chris who's supposed to be fighting and not Gary's going as a spare. But have a look at them, have a look at the kid he's fighting. And if you think this kid looks tasty, and you can generally tell, put Sykes in with him, because Chris Dawson's a little bit, he's not quite as polished as Gary. So I had a look at the kid down in Redcar, and I just knew he was a half decent kid, just looking at him physically, and had a little chat to his coach. And because you've got to be open and transparent with amateurs, haven't you? And you've got to say, listen, it's his first fight, but don't match him hard. Or you get other kids where you're quite open and you say, this kid's a real good fight for a debutant. And I had a chat with a coach, and he said the same thing. He says, my kid's not bad at all. I'm going to be open with you. I says, well, I've got another lad here, Gary Sykes, same weight, never boxed. I says, but he's not bad as well. So we were quite transparent, and Gary boxed, and he absolutely stood this kid on his head, and the kid was no mug at all. And I knew then Gary was something special. And I remember, I think it was before mobile phones, I rung Keith up, and I rung him up before we set off back, and I told him what had happened, and I just said to Keith, I says, Keith, I think you've got one here. There's something with this kid. So I worked with Gary for about his first season or 2 seasons in the amateurs. I'll never take credit for his amateur success. That's Keith Tate. Keith Tate took him to the national titles. He took him to the ABA elite title. But what always happened, Jamie, was Gary and I left then to go. I went into the pros with Mally McIver, and I cut my teeth in the pros. We left the gym, various reasons. But Gary always kept in touch with me. I'd see him now and again running and various things. And he always said, if I ever go pro, Jules, will you train me? And I ever said, no, you're going to need a full-time pro. You're going to need the best of the best. But he always held me to it. And he says, please, will you train me? So I finished with Mally McIver about 2000, I forget the day, about 2005. And Gary had won the ABAs, and he boxed for England internationally probably 8 or 9 times. And he rung me and he says, I'm going pro. Will you work with me? And I said, no, but I'll have a look at you, and maybe I can help get you with, some of I still had contacts in the pros. I said, maybe I can get you with someone else. And there was a bit of friction between me and Keith when I went back, to be completely transparent with you. But we kind of picked it up from there. We had a year in the gym when Sykes couldn't box because he was locked into a contract, and I didn't like the contract. And then Gary basically asked me to just look after everything. He says, I want you to train me. I want you to get me out of this contract. I want you to get me with somebody else. And I guess we went from there, really, Jamie.
So someone's just asking a question. So did you ever go to the Ingles in Sheffield?
I've been to the Ingles many times, but never to train there, or never to, obviously, to box there. Gary, probably... We probably went about 6 or 7 times. Sykes had sparred down there. Lee Wood, Jordan Gill. He sparred Kid Galahad. Quite a few times he sparred Kid Galahad, and probably a little bit later in Gary's career, to be honest. But I know Dom Ingle well. Dom Ingle's a really top guy. I didn't know Brendan that well, Jamie, to be honest, because Brendan it wasn't well in the later years when I came across him. He was always polite, but he wasn't well. I came across John a few times, but Dom and I, would always chat on the phone. He was always really good sorting sparring for Sykes, and he would pay Gary for that sparring as well, because he knew Gary would sometimes struggle for money. But it was a fantastic gym. You look at the Ingle gym, and of course, as you know, I've chatted to Junior Witter over there. I saw Junior several times, but I think what Brendan did with fighters was phenomenal. And I think Dom Ingle did a great job as well. He had a different style of coaching to Brendan, but fantastic gym.
And just Gary Sykes, kind of finishing up. So English champion, two-time British champion, Commonwealth title challenger, prize fighter. Had the Adrian Broner fight, woke up drunk, and then thought it was a dream.
The Broner fight was just, it gutted him, because what people don't realise about Gary Sykes, again, I'm brutally honest where Gary's concerned, Gary wasn't always the most dedicated outside of the ring, but he went through a stage where the big names wouldn't fight him. Now, that's not me just saying that claim, that's a statement of fact. So when Kevin Mitchell was a British super featherweight champion, Gary was mandatory, he beat Crawler, and Mitchell vacated rather than fight Sykes, and he had a bit of, it was out a few 6-rounders, and then Gary was supposed to fight Ricky Burns for the vacant British again. Burns stepped out rather than fight Sykes, and he waited 12 months before he fought for a world title. And later on, Stephen Smith, when Stephen Smith was the British champion, he had a choice to win the belt outright and defend against Sykes, and Stephen Smith avoided Sykes as well. Now, I'm not saying Mitchell, Burns and Smith wouldn't have beaten Sykes. What I'm saying is everybody knew Gary was a really hard, long night. So we had lots of disappointments, and the Adrian Broner one was probably the cruelest of all. So Gary was beating everybody out of sight. After he lost to Buckland, he lost his British title. We were going on the road. He was beating unbeaten kids like Kev Hooper, 40-0. He beat Johnny Case, who was 16-2. He was beating some really good kids with Sykes. Nobody wanted to touch him. And Steve Wood, who was Gary's manager at the time, I was actually at a friend's, Jamie, in Birmingham, and I got this text through from Steve Wood, and he said, if I said May, Adrian Broner for Sykes, WBO world title, what would you say to me? And this was about 6 weeks off, and I said, I'd probably say, Steve, that you've been on the beer. And Steve kind of rung me up. He goes, well, to be honest, Jules, he goes, I have had a couple of drinks. He says, but I've been offered Broner for Sykes. And Gary really loved Adrian Broner. We were kind of Broner at the time was unbeaten. He was world champion. He was knocking everybody out. And Steve said, have a think about it before you speak to Sykes. He goes, because I know you won't, do it if you don't think it's the right thing to do. And everybody wants to fight for a world title. That's your dream. Now, to fight for a world title in Las Vegas is the ultimate for any boxer. So someone said I didn't believe Steve. I said, Steve, have you got this right? Adrian Broner, why Gary Sykes? And what they wanted to do, they were trying to break Broner to a UK audience. And they'd offered that fight to so many really well-known British fighters, like Derry Matthews, Gary Buckland, several big-name British fighters in the division had turned it down. They didn't want to touch Broner, rightly so. So Steve Wood sent me an email from Eric Gomez from Golden Boy, and then I realised it was a genuine offer. So I thought I'd better go find Sykes. He'd been AWOL, he'd not been in the gym for a few weeks, probably, having a few beers and putting on a couple of stone like he used to do. And I went and I found one of his mates, a lad called Gary Witter, and I goes, I need to track Sykes down. It's massively important. If he's doing something he shouldn't be doing, I'm not going to have a go at him. It's really important. So we ended up tracking him down at some flat or some house up Dewsbury Moor. And Gary had a few beers. And I basically sat him down and I says, right, this you might think it's a bit of a wind-up. And I just showed him the email from Eric Gomez and the text from Steve Woods. And Sykes just went, yeah, I'll fight Broner, no problem. Never asked when, how much, never even batted an eyelid. So the morning after I'd gone home, I said, right, have a coffee, get yourself to bed. We'll get up early in the morning. We're probably going to have to, start thinking about training. And the morning after, Sykes rung me up. He says, Jules, I had a dream last night that you came to see me. And you said I was going to fight Adrian Broner. I says, I was dreaming, weren't I? I don't know if he thought I was tripping or something. I says, no, Gary. And I sent him the screenshots and stuff. And he was like, oh. And he rung me up. He says, what do you think will happen? I says, probably knock you out, Gary. Really honest. He says, what do you want to do? He says, let's do it. Let's do it. So we trained for 5-6 weeks. We got the visa, went down to London to get his visa, work visa stamped. And Sykes had never trained as hard in his life. And he was actually living with me at the time. What used to happen, Jamie, used to have to move him in with us because he liked to drink. He was a bit naughty. He didn't always live like a fighter should. So my wife at the time and myself moved him in, and I woke up very early one morning, and it was all over the news, it was all over Twitter that Lamont Peterson had failed the drug test, because Peterson-Khan rematch was the main event. And I had to go kind of wake Sykes up and sort of tell him that the Broner fight, it looked like it was dead in the water. And that absolutely crushed him. But for me, it always tells the story of Sykes' mentality. Didn't care. You know, it wasn't a huge payday. It was $65,000. After paying US tax and various things, he'd have walked away with about 30 grand. And Sykes didn't care. He would fight anybody. But my job as his coach was to look after him. And part of the training, what we did in that camp, Jamie, was really just to get through the first few rounds. You know, we were just training to be like ultra defensive, get him as strong as he could be. I said, because Broner starts quick and there's a real good chance, Gaz, he's going to catch you early. So we trained actually quite defensively, which went against Gary's complete nature. But we used to have a bit of a joke, me and John, the other lad in the gym. We had a bit of a joke, and we'd get him sparring, we'd hold the white towel, and we'd say, right, how quickly can one of us throw the towel in if Sykes gets tagged? And it was just banter, you know, it was one of those things, but it was brilliant times in the gym. Terry Flanagan would come out. Josh Warrington actually was English champion at the time. And twice Josh Warrington would come literally at midnight and spar Sykes, because sometimes we tried to get him used to Vegas time. And I'll never forget Josh doing that, actually. And Sean O'Hagan and Josh, they would come over to Batley. You know, how many people who work full time can you get out of bed to come and train with you in the crazy hours of the morning? And Sean and Josh did that. And there were fantastic times. And it was just such a shame that the fight didn't happen. There was no chance of it being rescheduled. Broner moved on. And Gary never really recovered from that, Jamie. He'd one disappointment after another, after another, after another. And even though he went on to regain the British title, it was probably shot at that point. When he won the British title back in Dewsbury against John Case, he was a faded fighter by that point. But absolute, at his best, Sykes was absolutely brilliant, and we used to fall out all the time because he's the complete opposite of me. I'm like a real stickler for timekeeping. I'm really tidy, a bit OCD if I'm being completely honest. And Sykes was the complete opposite. It was all over the place, slack as hell. And we used to fall out like, you know, like big brother and little brother. And these things happen. But the one thing I always said about Gary Sykes is he had no bad in him whatsoever. You know, we still speak regularly, we chat all the time, and the kid had absolutely no badness in him whatsoever.
You know, so that's exactly how I've explained him, described him. Like, that's exactly what I've probably said to the wife about him for the last 8 years. There's not an ounce of badness. He's shit. You know, I tell him it all the time. But yeah, I've got a great love for him. Josh Warrington, just a kid from the estate of Leeds, and he's gone on to become quite a someone.
They've done a fantastic job, and Josh Warrington, and if Josh was sat here, he wouldn't object to what I'm about to say. So Josh and his dad used to train in the gym where I was me and Sykes, for about 2.5 years, 3 years. They would train with us in the gym, and I'd known Sean and Josh through VIP promotions. I met Josh when he was 15, actually, when he was a young kid over at Lockers in Wanwell. And I think the key difference between Sykes and Warrington was Josh used to look up to Gary, and Gary was probably a little bit more talented than Josh. But for me, yeah, Josh used to work full time. He used to come all the way over from Leeds to work with myself or work with Sean, his dad, and he was always 5-10 minutes early. And at that time, Sykes wasn't working. He'd given up his working full time for quite a few years, and Sykes could never get in the gym on time. And it's little things like that you notice, that, you know, you got a kid called Josh. He was a dental technician or a dental assistant. He would come all the way over from Leeds, and he was never late, and he would never be rushing out the gym. Whereas Gary was always somewhere he had to be all the time. And did I ever imagine Josh, because they left the gym and they went on and did their own thing, did I ever imagine Josh winning the titles that he did? Absolutely not. I never thought in a million years. I thought Josh was capable of a British title at the time, because he was so tough and he was so fit and he was so focused. I thought he might have won a British title, but the success he had was unbelievable.
Yeah, it's Josh Warrington is a real rags to riches because as an amateur, he wasn't blessed with any GB squads or
No.
national titles. So he literally, he sacrificed his whole life when his mates are out drinking and all this. And do you know what? He along with Ricky Burns, probably, I mean, obviously Gary as well, but they're the people that I've met, got quite to know quite well, and thought you're actually even nicer than what I first thought.
Yeah, I knew Josh I've known him well, and listen, it's no secret, him and his dad, his father and I had a bit of a fallout at one point. It was quite public. This happens in boxing. Sean and I are fine now. We're absolutely fine. Sometimes, Jamie, I'd just quickly address that one. What sometimes happens when you are friends with somebody and you work with somebody is third parties get involved. And that things happened and things were said. And thankfully, Sean and I are absolutely fine now. We went out for dinner about a year ago or so. We don't chat every 2 minutes, but Sean and I are fine. I had a young professional I was training at the time, and we went over and he sparred Warrington. And the only difference I noticed with Josh when I went over to Garthurth in the gym where they were was he's just so focused now. And the thing that always strikes me about Josh is he's a humble guy, he's a down-to-earth guy. I think sometimes he's misrepresented on social media when, for example, the Kid Galahad build-up and some of the build-ups to the fights, people think he's a little bit arrogant. He's really not. I think he's just trying to put the game face on there and get himself up for the fights. But Josh was always very, very humble. But the difference with Josh and probably any fighter, any professional fighter I've come across, is the intensity that he trains at. It's insane. If you watch, you see fighters hit a bag, they just hit the bag. They just go through the motions or the build up to a crescendo. You ever watch Josh Warrington work out on a bag? He'll smash that bag for half an hour at full intensity. And probably another fighter you just mentioned who used to train like that was Ricky Burns. So we went down to the gym several times, and Sykes sparred Ricky Burns when Burns was world champion. And Burns was the same thing. It just the intensity that Warrington and Burns used to train at was just a different level. I met everybody else. And I think they were making up for lacking probably some of those skill sets that more celebrated fighters have, because as you've said, Josh wasn't the most gifted. I'm not saying he didn't have a gift for boxing, but his attributes was his work rate, his toughness and his strength. He was so strong. He wasn't a puncher, but he was so strong and he was so focused. And even when we went over to Garthurth, 12, 18 months ago, Josh was just so focused and nothing was going to stop him achieving what he wanted to achieve. And even though it looks now like he's probably on the downside of his career, who would have thought that like I say, a young kid from a council estate in Leeds would have gone on to have that success he's had? You can't, no matter what's gone on over the years with myself and Sean, when Josh beat Lee Selby and he won the world title, even though we'd kind of had a fallout, I was still immensely proud of them because I'd been part of their journey. And people love to knock success, don't they? On any level, people love to knock success, and people try and knock Josh and Sean. You can't knock what those guys have achieved. It's impossible.
Absolutely. And another guy, I've just literally finished his biography. A guy I know very, very interesting. Oh, where do I start with McManus? Probably the most serious person I've ever met in my life. He's the one. See, I'm quite stupid, and I have to probably check myself sometimes. I can't send him the joke that I'll send 10 others. But I do like him. I liked him when I met him. He's so I met him. I spoke to him 2015. I met him 2016, and he's unforgettable. He's someone who sticks in your brain. You like him or you don't like him. So, last couple of weeks when I've been speaking to people, I've kind of, I got quotes from people and that, and I always gently approach Nick Manners, and then some people go, "Oh, I love Nick," like himself, and then there's, but he is what he is. Doesn't give a shit. How did you meet Nick?
I've known Nick a long time, obviously from the Leeds boxing scene. Now, Nick's brother Rick Manners used to co-manage Gary Sykes right in the early days, 2006. And I met Nick through Rick just at the Leeds Town Hall shows and stuff like that. And the one thing that what Nick doesn't do is he says it as it is, but he's always really, really complimentary. And
yeah,
I would see him on the Leeds shows and a bit of sparring here and there. And he was always really complimentary about the job that I did with Sykes. Obviously, I had the tools to work with as well. And it would always praise me, and we'd chat on social media and things such as that. And then over the years, we have each other's numbers. We'll sometimes have a conversation. I've known Nick now for, well, you forget, don't you? It must be 13, 14, 15 years. I also remember reading about him in Boxing News when he was a pro, really heavy-handed fighter. Big middleweight, small light heavyweight, whichever way you want to look at it. But he's just a character. And then when I went over to 18 months or so ago, I went over to, got a kid who was sparring Josh Warrington, and Nicky was over there, and we'd always have a good chat. Yeah, I kind of like his wavelength, as you say, it's quite serious, and he's one of these characters. It can look like it's intimidating. He'll talk and really look you in the eye. When he's talking to you, and he's taking in everything that you're saying to him. But he's also got really good peripheral vision and senses as Nick, and he doesn't miss anything what's going around him at the same time. So he's one of those guys who can have a proper focused conversation with you and get your attention, but pick up his sensors are picking up everything else. I went over to his gym about 6 months ago. I had heavyweight. I was just doing a little bit of work with. I don't really coach much now, and we went over there, and Nick and Colin and myself, we did a bit of a YouTube thing up for Porky's Corner for Russell Hartley's channel. And Nick's just great. I like him. I get on with him. I have a lot of respect for him. He was brought up tough, him and his brothers, in that era when I'm not saying there's no racism now. There's a lot of racism around, in the kind of 70s and 80s, and you. Either in Leeds at that time, you could fight or you had a tough time.
Michael Shower's book, Racism, and then Junior Witter's Racism, and then Nick Manners. But in the 80s, 70s and 80s, I think it was zero tolerance about 93. But it was normal that people could say things. At a football match, I mean, I'm just I'm getting bombarded with trolls at the minute. But
I can't. My eyes aren't great, so I can't see the messages, to be honest, Jamie. But
it was a normal life where people could say them kind of things. And Nick Manners is, I mean, Josh said something to me the other week, the month for his biography. Nick's always on the defensive, and I think that's a lot to do with how he was brought up. Nick's kind of, sometimes I say to him, I'm not going anywhere, just it's me and you, do you know what I mean? And very, very serious, but I do trust him, and that I wouldn't have went anywhere near him if I didn't, because he can be quite scary. He's a big 6'2" black man in shape, could punch hard.
Yeah.
Knocked, in my opinion, out Paul Sykes, the toughest man probably ever. And according to Colin Hart, Joe Calzaghe was the greatest fighter Britain's ever had, and Nick done quite well against him. So he hasn't done too bad. But I've got a lot of love for Nick. As I said, his book's going to be coming out very shortly. Another character whose book I'm on chapter 5 now of about a 22 chapter biography is Junior the Hitter Witter. I
could talk forever about Junior Witter because I trained a fighter in Sykes who was largely avoided. He wasn't a huge ticket seller, in spite of what people say. He wasn't. And I knew how tough it was for Sykes to kind of get any kind of luck or any breakthrough in his career. We had to battle for absolutely everything. But at least Sykes had a fan-friendly style. And I think Junior, he was, it's part of the Who Needs Him club. So he's everything. Junior Witter's everything that's wrong with boxing, because his skill level and his skill set and his accomplishments, that guy should be a multimillionaire right now, and he should be a much more celebrated fighter than he was. Even though it wasn't the greatest spectacle, he fought at short notice. He fought Zab Judah. Zab Judah at the time was absolutely a phenomenal American fighter, and Witter went 12 rounds with him, and he gave him a fight, and he did that short notice with hardly any experience whatsoever. And in some ways, didn't help Junior, did it? Because he went on a run of knocking out some pretty good fighters, domestic level, the Alan Temples and Alan Boswells. He was sparking those guys, very useful fighters. And obviously Battaglia and Giuseppe Lauri and all those guys. He beat some really, really good fighters. But who really wanted to fight Junior Witter at that time and give him an opportunity? And Junior might disagree with me now, but when he did eventually get his shot against Vivian Harris, and DeMarcus Corley, when he fought those two guys, and obviously he fought Tim Bradley, I thought it was on the slide already at that point. When you're a fighter that heavily relies on reflexes, generally it's your early 20s to 26, 27 when you're at your absolute pinnacle. And I thought Witter was largely avoided by his peers, and he wasn't a ticket seller. And that's the one great crime about boxing, as I've mentioned with Sykes and with other fighters. If you're not a big ticket seller, you don't kiss promoters and certain people in the boxing industry's backside, you won't really get the rewards that you deserve. And I thought that was really unfortunate with Junior Witter, and such a, the way I'm talking now, you'd think he hadn't won anything. Obviously, he was a British, European, Commonwealth, and WBC world champion. He won everything that was worth winning.
Completed boxing. So he completed the sport of boxing.
It was just, listen, if I'd been managing Ricky Hatton at that time, when I talk about that time, people always get the years mixed up, when I believe Hatton's management, I don't think fighters generally avoid fighters, but Hatton's management definitely avoided Junior Witter. Now, anybody who says that's not true doesn't understand how boxing works, boxing politics. I understand how it works perfectly. I held a professional license for 20 years. There was a time where Junior Witter was knocking out everybody. And there was a time where Ricky Hatton still was coming through, at his WBU title reign. And around about 2002, when Hatton was kind of at that point, he was knocked down and hurt quite badly by Eamon McGee. That was the time when we'd been promised the Witter fight by Frank Warren and by Sky. And Hatton's management didn't want that fight. Now, Junior Witter was all wrong at that stage for Ricky Hatton. I'm always a realist. Ricky Hatton enjoyed a better career than Junior Witter. The later version of Hatton and Witter, Hatton might have been too much, I don't know. But I truly believe in the early days, when they're both coming through the WBU and Witter was cleaning up European-wise, I truly believe that Witter at that point would have beaten Hatton. We saw what Hatton always struggled with: sharp shooters, southpaws, and Witter was a switcher, of course. And, he struggled with Thaxton, with Eamon McGee. Later on, was it Lascania? I forget the names. He struggled with southpaws, and obviously we saw what Manny Pacquiao did, but Pacquiao was a different gravy. But Hatton would have really struggled with Witter in 2002, 2003, 2004, and they did the right thing. Their job was to keep the cash cow moving, to match Hatton carefully, which is what they did. They put him through against faded ex-champions and fighters who were coming up through the weights. And Hatton had a phenomenal career, and Junior Witter didn't have a career that certainly from an earning capacity point of view, that compared to Hatton's. But for me, it was everything that was wrong with boxing. However, had I been managing and training Ricky Hatton right now at that point, would I have taken Junior Witter? Absolutely not.
See, Johnny Nelson said to me, he said Junior, so Ricky was put in against John Thaxton. So Brendan was using John Thaxton as a yardstick, and it definitely looked a lot better than he did. He said that fight was on, but he said, you know what, Hatton kind of struggled with John Thaxton. I think he got a cut, right. And he said that was the closest that fight was ever going to be made. But you know, one of the quotes that you said the other week, and I spoke to Junior and I said, listen, we need to use this for the book, and it was something like, boxing shafted Junior Witter, but he's still done it all.
He did. I mean, that tells me how good was Junior Witter, that he still go out and win every title in boxing worth winning when everything was still against him. And people would listen to him and say, what do you mean everything was against him? And the TV networks never loved him. You know, I don't even know if he could have sold out in Bradford, and I'm being very polite there to Junior.
I mean, Junior openly admits, he said, I was from Bradford, but I was based in Sheffield. Junior didn't have every support from the local football team, didn't go drinking, playing darts. And as I said with this biography, Ricky Hatton was Luke Skywalker. Junior had to be Darth Vader. He had to be the Panaman villain. He's behind you. And he did it, but it is an absolute crying shame that I think it's the greatest fight British boxing's never seen.
Absolutely, and that's why I've been in the sport for a long time, but I'm a boxing fan first and foremost. And you look at the great fights globally. We never had Larry Holmes and Foreman. We never had Riddick Bowe, Lennox Lewis, you know, on a global scale. And, you know, it looks like the Joshua Fury fight's very unlikely going to happen. And it's certainly not the competitive fight that, you know, we wanted. But if we go back to Witter and Hatton at that time domestically, it was a massive, massive fight. But we had an era in the 50s and 60s and 70s, for example, where the Finnegans and the Minters and all those guys fought each other, not just once, but 2, 3, 4 times. And we always found out who was the best domestically. And then the winner would move on and progress European-wise and then go through the worlds. And there's just some... Now it's an overused cliche that boxing is a business, Jamie. Of course, boxing's a business. Boxing's always been a business, but it's also been a sport. So boxing for me I believe sport should be 2 things. I believe it should be entertaining, but I also believe it should be a level playing field. And when you find in boxing, and you know, Nick Manners will say the same thing, it just isn't the case. If you sell tickets, if you're loved by the media darlings, you'll have a very, very different career to the likes of Junior Witter, who effectively had to go out and force every single opportunity that I ever had. Like I said, fighting Zab Judah at short notice. How many fighters do you know would have taken Zab Judah at that point? Had Ricky Hatton been approached to fight Zab Judah at that point, would Ricky Hatton's management have taken that?
Ricky Hatton was offered the fight before Junior.
Well, there you go. And that's exactly what I said, isn't it, about Gary Sykes when he was fighting Broner. That fight got offered to other fighters before Gary Sykes, and they all turned it down. So was it the right thing for Hatton to do then if he was offered the Zab Judah fight? Was it the right thing to turn it down? Absolutely. He wasn't seasoned enough. But the Ingle fighters also, that, you know, we've got the celebrated Ingle fighters who everybody knows about, Nazim Ahmed, etc. But the Ingle fighters, the kind of next tier down, they were always very, very tough. They were match tough. You know, Brendan and Dom didn't dress people up in wrap them up in cotton wool. Johnny Nelson had a very tough career early on, and then when he had the 2 fights which were very forgettable fights for the Cruiserweight Championship against Carlos Dillon and James Waring, Johnny Nelson had to go on the road fighting dangerous heavyweights, you know, and he had to learn his craft before he eventually became a world champion. And that was the route that the Ingle fighters often took, was they had a very, very tough schooling, and a tough upbringing. And some of them, it made them better fighters, and some of them maybe it knocked the soul out of them. But with Junior, he just was never a popular fighter, was he? He wasn't a conventional fighter, and he did everything wrong. And when fighters do everything wrong like he did, they're incredibly dangerous.
Yeah, well, the thing is, and I think Junior said to me now, he said, if I could have my time back, he said, I didn't realise at the time boxing was a business, so I should have been playing up to the camera. And he didn't. Junior relied purely on results. And that's just not how boxing's run. So any questions for Julian? So a couple of more questions, Julian, before I talk about your channel. I'm going to say a couple of names and just say a couple of things. So Tommy Miller, who was he?
So Tommy Miller was a very well-known, obviously he was an ex-professional fighter himself during a time when late 30s, early 40s, when boxing was very tough. And he's known for being Paul Sykes' coach, of course, but what Tommy actually did was, I think his first success once he went over to training and managing fighters, his first success was with Prince Rodney. Prince Rodney's a well-known Huddersfield, I think he lives down south now, does Prince, but Prince was a really capable light middleweight at the time, and I know that Tommy Miller had a lot of success with Prince Rodney, and he was just known in the boxing circles. And I think at one point, Jamie, I think Tommy Miller was the oldest license holder with the British Boxing Board of Control. He must have held his license for 50 years or something. It was incredible. But very old school ex-fighter, very old school coach and manager, shrewd, knew the business inside and out, and certainly in these areas, Huddersfield, I think it was from Halifax, I think he was very well respected.
Yeah, I mean, he was a dying breed in that game. In that game, John Spencer said to me, he said he would pull tricks I wouldn't have dreamed of. You know, one show when he was lacking bout, he put his own son in, and when his son got knocked out, he said, "Oh no, the wife's going to kill me." He was, you know, and that kind of characters like your Terry Lawlesses, your Harry Levines, your Mickey, Jarvis Astairs, your Mike Barretts. It's just the yesteryear's characters, but I think British boxing is not as rich with its heritage that it once was.
No, we've got a lot of people who just want to be kind of Instagram coaches and big names, and they play the game and they're in with the cliques and things, and that frustrates me. I mean, the first manager I ever worked with when I trained Mally McIver was Darky Smith. Now, Darky Smith was dyed-in-the-wool, hardcore boxing royalty. You know, he trained and managed Zelko Babovic, who fought Lennox Lewis for the undisputed heavyweight championship. But I was around the Keith Tates and the Darky Smiths when I was kind of cutting my teeth as a young coach. These people were no-nonsense people, but as you just said, they would also know all the tricks of boxing, perhaps pull some stunts that you might not appreciate this day and age, but they had kind of tough careers themselves and tough upbringings, and that's how they brought us up. When I was an amateur, we were looked after, we were matched tough. You know, you didn't spar when you wanted to. You know, culturally, Jamie, I've seen some massive changes in amateur boxing. I went back into coaching about 4 or 5 years ago, and the cultural changes, I couldn't believe what I was seeing. But we were matched tough, and we would box who we were told, when we were told, and there was no discussion about that. But yeah, in terms of boxing now, we've got a lot of one-dimensional characters in the game, you know, and I think that's why you mentioned Nick Manners. I think it's good to have a Nick Manners in boxing, because whether you like Nick or whether you don't like Nick, he's at least a character, isn't he?
Absolutely. And, you know, when I think of characters, I think of Eddie Fossey, Denny Mancini, and Nick Manners. He's a proper boxing man. And this is why last year he asked me, and within 2 seconds I said yes. But if I'd have met him last year, I'd have been, I don't know. But because I've been around him now over 7 years, I know what he's about. I know exactly what about, and I know he knows. He wouldn't have asked me if I'd have been, you know, I wouldn't have lasted very long if I'd have been a slippy character with someone like Nick Manners. Couple of more names, Julian, then. Adam Fogarty, heavyweight. George, actor. So he was a heavyweight in
Yeah.
Huddersfield, rugby player, now an actor.
Big tough guy, Adam Fogarty. I remember him boxing at the Frontier. I think he had a couple of fights at the Batley Frontier in the day when Keith Tate and Merlin Trademore used to have their own promotions down there. He's just one of those guys. Sometimes you get people from rugby, and Adam Fogarty was one of them. Never aesthetically good to watch, but you know what you're getting with him. Strong, heavy-handed, and durable. He might have even boxed at Dewsbury Town Hall as well. Not Town Hall, at Dewsbury Sports Centre as well, because there was a time when we used to have boxing at Dewsbury Sports Centre. Errol Bomber Graham boxed there, Henry Wharton boxed there, and I could be wrong, but I think Adam Fogarty once boxed in Dewsbury as well. But he was just known as being a big, tough handful, and probably not somebody that you would want to upset.
Yeah, he rang me a couple of years back just to talk about Paul Sykes, and then of course he started telling me all his Paul Sykes stories. Yeah, he actually beat John Fury, didn't he?
That's
Fury
right.
had a crack. Fury was something like 20-1 or something. But Julian, so I've known of you for probably well, through Gary Sykes, but I started watching your channel, and but when you find channels on YouTube which is not about bullying people and being negative and trolls, all that kind of thing, that gets my attention. And I watched a couple of your things, and I know you can tell I know what you're on about. So anyone who fancies following Julian, I'm going to put his link. I'm going to put the link in the bio to click on it, give him a follow. What's your channel about, Julian?
I've had a YouTube account for about 10 years, and literally just in the last year or two, I've just started putting up a few prediction videos. What used to happen was on Facebook, because it's not just about the predictions for me, it's about breaking down as a coach how each fighter might take on each fighter. So I put some videos or some prediction videos on Facebook 5, 6, 7 years ago, and I used to get followed by some quite well-known ex-pros, and they used to say, "Are you going to do a big preview of the Fury Wilder fight or the Hatton fight or the Hatton Mayweather fight and stuff?" And I used to put the predictions on and break them down, and you get some wrong, but generally I would kind of get the outcome right. And it just came off Facebook because, you know, Jamie, social media can be absolutely toxic. So I came off Facebook about 2 years ago, but then I had quite a few people saying, just listen, I know you're not worried about, you know, big numbers, but can you preview this fight? Because I like listening to you. Listen, I'm not everybody's cup of tea. Some people fall asleep. I go on a little bit long. You be guys getting a sense of this right now, but some people like the real detailed analytical breakdown. So what I try and do is just break down a few big fights, put the predictions out there. Some I get right, some I get wrong. But for me, it's what's more interesting than getting the outcome of the fight right is getting the approach wrong. Getting the approach right. And it's just a part of boxing. I'm not really actively coaching right now, but I just enjoy breaking fights down. It's always been my thing. I watch boxing every single night on YouTube. I watch boxing from the 60s, 70s, 80s. I love analysing the great fighters. I love analysing the technical aspect of it. So it's just me talking generally about boxing predictions. And I don't just make the predictions on the fights, Jamie. Sometimes what I do is I make predictions on the outcomes of certain things, like the Conor Benn situation, for example. You know, I think it was always going to be a soft ban or no ban at all. And it's because I've been involved in boxing, you kind of know how things work and the money machine behind it. So I just talk about a few things that people ask me to do. I don't always have time to do it. You know, sometimes you're working, etc. But if I get a chance, I like to just break things down. And more importantly, I like people to comment so we can interact and we can just chat about boxing, really. I'm not about the trolls. If someone wants to say, MacGowan, I think you're absolutely wrong, I think you're talking nonsense, and give me a real informed, articulate opinion why they believe I'm wrong, absolutely perfect. I love that. I love debating that side of it. If someone's just hostile and just rude for the sake of it, I just remove them, Jamie. And that's because I don't really need that in my life.
Yeah, totally agree. I've just blocked about 15 on here. It's, you know, I didn't know how to take it years ago. Got massive forms of anxiety. Where now I just say I don't give a shit. I'm writing 100 books in my life. I'm on 26 at the minute. You're making a fake account on me, slagging me off. Do you know what I mean? So who gives a shit? But there's a question for you there, Julian, on the screen.
Yeah, can you read it out for me? Because my eyes aren't what they used to be, Jamie.
Yeah. If Conor Benn had a fight with Eubank Jr., who do you think would have won the fight?
Well, I did a couple of videos about that. I think it was criminal suggesting they boil Eubank Jr. down to 157. So none of us really knew what the rehydration clause was. In simple terms, we know that Conor Benn's a welterweight and Eubank Jr. is a middleweight. Had that fight been 160 pounds, with no caveats about the weight, Eubank Jr. would have absolutely schooled Conor Benn. There's no doubt about it. He was a more seasoned fighter. He was a bigger fighter. But what would have happened, you know, who knows what cocktails Conor Benn's had been taking. That's obviously for VADA and for the British Boxing Board of Control to look at, not for me. But I think Eubank's a bigger fighter, a more seasoned fighter. I think Ben's been developed a certain path, a certain matchroom path, but Eubank, fully hydrated, would have beaten him. But I had serious concerns about Eubank at 157 and potentially only being allowed to put on 5 pounds. So the morning of the fight being 162, I think that would have been dangerous. And Conor Benn might have been fighting a shell of a man that night. So Ben would have had a really good chance with the weights being what they were. So
tell us all what your channel's called, Julian.
It's called Julian MacGowan Boxing Predictions. It does what it says on the tin. It's just predicting generally big fights that come up. I'll be doing a Eubank Jr. Beefy Smith prediction probably in the next week or so. That's an intriguing fight. And it's just me chatting boxing. And again, if anybody wants to come on and have a chat about boxing, equally, I'd enjoy that. It's not monetized, Jamie, at the moment. It's purely simply because it'd be more hassle for me than not if it was monetized because of work and tax codes and all that kind of stuff. But it's not a massive channel. I don't have the kind of followers that you've got or that other people have got. And it's just we've got a nice group of people who come on and talk boxing.
So if anyone wants to click over to Julian's channel, I'm going to put, when I finish this, I'm going to put the link in the bio. So what's your future plans, Julian?
In terms of boxing, I don't know. I'm not arrogant. I'm just direct, as you know. So I get a lot of offers still to work with fighters. I handed in my British Boxing Board of Control license in the summer because I had a dispute with them over Gary Sykes's outright belt. That's been and gone now. Not a lot I can do about that.
Pretty disgraceful. I actually know quite
scandalous. Scandalous how the Boxing Board of Control didn't give him his belt outright because they said the Carl Johansson fight wasn't a mandatory defence, and we knew it was. Disgraceful how they treated him. He was an unconventional fighter, and I don't think they wanted to spend 12, 13 grand having a belt made, and they got out of that. Absolutely horrendous. But in terms of coaching, I've done a little bit in the last year or so with a couple of kids. I get offers all the time. I don't mean that in an arrogant way. I get offers to train people all the time. I went to a show a few weeks ago, as one of Dennis Hobson's guests, and I was sat there and I had someone asking me if he would train his son who was just turned pro. But right now, Jamie, I've 26, 27 years training amateurs and pros. It takes its toll. That's on top of working full time, running my own house. I think I've got 4 kids. They're not babies anymore, but I have four kids. So at the moment, I'm taking some time out. It's unlikely that I'll return to coaching, but I've said that before and then I've been dragged back in. So never say never, Jamie, but I'm enjoying just talking to people like such yourself, knowledgeable boxing people, interesting people. I'm enjoying this side of it right now, and it means I'm not stuck in a cold gym 3 hours every night as well. So no immediate plans to coach again.
And does Julian MacGowan still have the love for the game as you once did?
No, absolutely not. I saw what boxing did to Gary Sykes. I saw what boxing did to certain people. I hate the monopoly that we had recently with, you know, just the way the fights and boxing's going, the best not fighting the best, promoters not working with each other. I hate that side of it. But what I will say is when boxing is on in its purest form and you see two evenly matched fighters giving 100%, I don't care if that's two evenly matched fighters on a club show, amateur level, or if it's world-class fighters, when we see even fights and the right mesh of styles, boxing is absolutely the best sport in the world. It's the most aesthetically amazing sport to watch. Boxers generally are the best people I've ever come across. There are people in boxing I absolutely love. There are other people in boxing I wouldn't give the time of day to. And as you can see, I'm bittersweet about the whole thing, Jamie. But if ever I want to, I love the sport of boxing, and if ever I just want to enjoy boxing, I just go on YouTube and I watch some classic fights from the classic fights that do it for me, and it just takes me away. And I love that. I can watch Hagler Mugabe every single night of the week, Sanchez Gomez, Aguero Pryor, and I watch those fights and I buzz. But boxing is a sport in decline. People still earn a fortune from it. The big shows are still big, but at grassroots to mid-level, boxing's really in decline. There's a lot of struggling promoters out there. There's a lot of fighters out there who can fight, who will never, ever, ever get the opportunity. And there are other fighters out there who aren't the best, and they will get the opportunity to make a lot of money based on massive social media platforms, based on boxing being what boxing is. So I love the sport, but I hate the organisational administrative side of boxing. I hate that with a passion.
Do you know what, Julian? I could speak to you all day, mate. It's been an absolute pleasure, sir. So I'm going to give your channel a big push now. I'm going to give it a push. Anyone who loved listening to Julian, I've started watching his channel the last couple of weeks. Head over. If you want the link, click in the bio, click on it, it'll take you down to Julian's channel. Absolute pleasure, sir. Thank you so much for your time.
One final thing, Jamie, one final thing. I truly believe this and I live by this. Anybody who's watching this or watching your channel or watching anybody's channel, if you got nothing nice to say, don't say anything at all. That's what my mum always said to me.
Yeah. Oh, it's. You know what? I mean, years ago you could go on YouTube, it'd be informative and things, where now it's just like same bullshit. You know what I mean? But Winston Churchill said, if you want to reach your destination, you never stop at every barking dog. So I don't give a shit.
Best way to be.
I'm just going to off the book just to fuck them off.
Well, people, the one thing I've learned, I study, as a coach, I study the psychological aspect of it. I know we're winding down, Jamie, but what I always do is I study human behaviour, and there's nothing more predictable than people. People and human behaviours are very, very predictable. And if I listen to people, I've always had my own mind. I do what I want. I don't care if that upsets people or not. If I listened to people, I would have never gone on Porky's Corner. I would never come on your channel. And I would have never gone on other channels, because people have always got something to say about you. That's the truth of human nature. And I think Sean O'Hagan said it really well once, and I'll wrap up on this. Sean O'Hagan always said, don't believe everything that you hear, don't believe everything that you read, and most of what you see you can't believe as well. And I think that's pretty true. Keep doing what you're doing. Don't worry about what anybody else has got to say about it. And ultimately, final thing is, I always talk about the man in the mirror. It's the man in the mirror moment. You only answer to you, Jamie, and I only answer to me. And ultimately, at the end of when that day comes, this is really deep, but when you get to the end of your life, if you're happy with what you see back, that's all that matters, and that's how I live my life.
Do you know that poem was in the Tony Adams biography? Did you read it?
I love that poem. I think it's so true, so true.
Yeah, do you know, I'm going to put this on my page. Do you know what, Julian? Thank you so much, sir. It's been an absolute pleasure.
And yourself, you take care and have a good week, the rest of the weekend, Jamie. Thank you.